Welcome back to the Morgan Ortagus Show on Sirius XM Patriot Channel 125. I'm incredibly excited to be at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. I'm interviewing someone who is a new ambassador to the United States. Mr. Laurent Bili is the ambassador of France to the United States. He is a long career diplomat with the French government, also was in China before he came to the United States. He's actually traveled quite a bit around the United States, so we're going to get into that as well. But we are lucky, Mr. Ambassador, to have you in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Morgan Ortagus Show.
Thanks a lot for having me.
So let's just start from the very beginning. Tell our audience a little bit about you and your diplomatic career.
So I'm a career diplomat. I've been a diplomat for 30 plus years. I spent 20 years of my life in defensive issues and especially on European defense and NATO. And after these 20 years, I've been ambassador in different countries like Thailand, Turkey, Brazil, China, and so since 1 year as the United States.
And how is the United States treating you so far?
Quite well, but it's challenging to be in DC because it's when you come from China, where the social life during the zero COVID policy was very slow. DC is a very demanding city.
It's a fast-paced town. You know, I just mentioned that you have traveled extensively around the United States, especially early in your diplomatic career. I know you're not supposed to pick favorites, but do you have a favorite state or favorite part of the country that you visited?
That's too tricky, but let's say that I've got a very special souvenir of Thompson Falls, Montana, because I stayed there for nearly 2 weeks and came back after, and people lost me there so nicely. Especially, I still remember, and I still have my teddy bear in wood because I was the guy making the longest trip to participate to the CB Lodger Association barbecue.
Oh, great.
On that occasion, I even trained for some country music, dancing, Virginia Reel. It's a great souvenir.
Well, this is a radio show, but I would ask you to demonstrate your country music dancing. But maybe next time, maybe after we've had some French wine. I love Montana as well, by the way, so you picked a great state. So I have to expand upon what you just mentioned at the beginning. You were ambassador to China, the French ambassador to China, before and after and during COVID. What was that like?
Well, it's, as you mentioned, so it's very different moments because before it was a moment where everybody was rushing to China, so I had a lot of delegation, and then the pandemic, it was much more about evacuating our citizens from Wuhan. After it was the pandemic in Europe, in the United States, so it was also a race to buy medical devices.
Right.
And then to learn also about the reopening after the shutdown. So it's a lot of different moments. And one of the painful moments was the lockdown of Shanghai, where we all have a lot of citizens and try to support them morally, in terms of also food. So it has been a real challenge. As a diplomat, I would say that was also an interesting moment because that's a moment where you see things changing. I faced at that moment the news of the aggression of Russia toward Ukraine, probably a moment of hesitation of China's position on that crisis. So a lot of different moments and challenging moments. I should have mentioned that we were isolated from the rest of the world, so very little visitors. And when I was going back home to see my wife, it been so 4 times in 3 years. To face long quarantine on my way back, the longest between being 3 weeks.
Wow. I can't imagine how tough that was. You know, there's an interesting conversation as it relates towards China that's happening in the United States. As you know, I was in the Trump administration, and our national security strategy was to focus away from counterterrorism, from those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and to shift our focus towards strategic competition with China and with Russia. And really, I think the Biden administration, in many ways, has extended a lot of the Trump administration policies towards China. The rhetoric might be different. But one of the things that's interesting about the United States as it relates to China is the national security establishment, both Republicans and Democrats and people who are in our civil service have a very similar view as it relates towards the threats from the Chinese Communist Party. But the views from New York, from the business community, from hedge funds, from corporate America is very different. They still want to do business with China. They want a détente, so to speak. I'm curious if it is similar in France, if you have the same sort of divide between the national security side and the business side of France. And just holistically, as the United States is clearly engaged in geopolitical competition with China, where does France come down on that issue?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not sure if the divide line is really between the business community and the political community, because at the same time, it's also a way that we have to look at foreign relations is also to encompass, economic politics. And somehow when the EU adopted the motto that we are both partner in some issues, competitors, especially in the trade field, but also systemic rival in the political sphere. It was that idea to have a kind of holistic approach toward China. And so I think in that we are not that far away of also the administration. The focus recently has been also to try to manage the competition. And I think it's important because when you have a country of the size of China, the idea of a confrontation doesn't bring any good. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the challenges, and we have to find a way to contain, to avoid that we work against the interests of all workers. And I think it was one of the merits of President Trump administration was to make us collectively realize that globalization was not working anymore in favor of European workers or American workers.
Right.
That we were, China was not playing by the book in terms of level playing field, competition, subsidies. And on that, I think we are now much more in the same level of awareness than a few years ago. Same time, I think we still have a lot of interests economically, and these interests are also in favor of all workers. We need also to export. We are business-like country, and China is also a huge market. So we have to find the balance between bringing back China to better practices and protect also the jobs that are dependent on Chinese markets.
So clearly China's on the top of mind in the United States, but what has to be on the top of mind for all of you and France is the existential threat that you face in Europe from Putin, from Russia. Obviously, in the Trump administration, of which I was a part, we were giving lethal aid to the Ukrainians, and we're very focused on deterring Putin from invading. Unfortunately, as we all know, the end of that story, that did happen over 2 years ago now. There's been a very hot debate in Washington as it relates to foreign aid, not just for Ukraine, but also for Israel and Taiwan, our own domestic production abilities. Explain to my audience, and some of them, to be quite frank, may be skeptical of why the United States should continue to send military aid to Ukraine. Can you tell our audience why you think America should continue to be in that fight?
Well, because I think it's in our interest, and I think the U.S. interest. I don't see a scenario to take an old say that where Russia wins and the U.S. don't lose. China is also looking at what the U.S. is doing, the world is looking at the results that the U.S. and the Europeans are doing. In a way, also, it's Europeans are doing a lot of. I'm not sure your audience realize that Europeans are spending 150 billions to support Ukraine, and that when we are building up our military capabilities, because now we are back on the famous 2% in NATO spending. Because 2 years ago, the aggression of Russia toward Ukraine changes. We are now not anymore harvesting the dividend of peace, but we face a real challenge. And so we want to be provider of security. And when we do that, 60% of what we are spending for military capabilities are also coming back to the US coffers. I think that's also important. And when we de-risk from Russia by not buying any more oil, or when we buy GNL, we buy GNL like Germany. 90% of the GNL that Germany is buying from the US. So it's also a contribution to the US economy. But more important, I think it's about the kind of world that we want to give to let to our children. And I think a world when the powerful can abuse of these less powerful neighbor. Yeah. And when we have seen these last days that the use of force in international relations become a normal pattern, that's a very dangerous world. And I think it's not of the interest of anyone and not of the US, of course.
You know, there's a very close relationship for obviously, in a long time since our nation's founding with France. And there's so many people that especially in America feel a kinship with France because of World War II. My grandfather was in the army and fought in Europe. And I think there's so many people that have those stories. And I think just our people-to-people ties, our cultural ties are incredibly close. There's almost every American young woman wants to be proposed to in Paris in front of the Eiffel Tower. So I think there's certainly a lot of cultural ties there. One of the most important alliances that we have anywhere in the world is, of course, NATO. And you just spoke about that. I think the point that you made about the 50 billion euros, I believe it is.
150.
150. I don't think that message gets out there enough, and I'm so glad you're bringing it on my show, for Americans to understand that France and Europe have skin in the game as it relates to the fight against Russia. 150 billion euros.
Especially because when the French speak about Europe or Europeans, you speak about European Union, and you have to add to that what the UK is doing, what Norway is doing. So we are really facing the challenge, and we really think that it's something very important for the world we have been building since World War II. And since you mentioned participation of your grandfather, I think we are going to celebrate D-Day, and we are so grateful for that generation. And I think it will be a very great moment to realize again what we stand for 80 years ago and what it has stake today.
I have a lot of friends in the military or retired military who love to go on D-Day and do the jump. And I keep claiming I'm going to do that with them one day. But, one of the things, too, that I think is really important, we were just talking about NATO, the French aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, its strike group is actually going to deploy under NATO command for the first time. Incredibly significant. Can you explain to our listeners what the Charles de Gaulle will be doing and what the NATO mission is?
I'm not sure I can enter in a lot of details about the mission, but let's say that symbolically it's very important because France has been along the last decades, very cautious in giving to a foreign nation its operational control to its means. And so it's a really demonstration of trust and the fact that we are really on the same boat, if I can say,
literally.
In that case. And so it's politically really significant. And it's interesting that in the domestic audience, there were no criticism because we really feel that we are together on that challenge.
I think it's been incredibly encouraging to hear President Macron, your president, and your government to speak out on behalf of Israel and the right to defend itself. We certainly have had massive political arguments here at home. And as a Jewish American, it's been incredibly encouraging to feel the support of France, not only to the Jewish people, but to the state of Israel. And I know that at least it's been publicly reported that France was a part of thwarting the attacks, the drones, the missiles that came over from Iran into Israel over the weekend. Are you able to expand a little bit more on what the French involvement was in thwarting that attack?
Well, I think in that issue, it's very important to have a moral clarity. And so, as you mentioned, the right of Israel to defend itself, a strong condemnation of terrorism was two key points of opposition. At the same time, also a call for a proportion of the answer and the respect of the international law. Regarding so with the last events, like other actors in the region, we have been playing our part when, let's say, some elements were flying.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things too is, obviously all the Iran and Israel attacks have been in the news. But what I think is really precarious for the Middle East and for global trade is that the Houthis in Yemen and the Iranians, even this week, continue to take over commercial shipping vessels in the Red Sea. We have U.S. Navy ships that are shot at from the Houthis, right, with ballistic missiles. And there's many reports as it relates to international shipping and commerce that it's being disrupted. So even once we get past the provocations and attacks from Iran and, of course, Israel's response, I think we're going to continue to see the challenge of freedom of navigation in that part of the world, freedom of the sea for commercial vessels. I know that France has been involved in this effort with the United States, but can you explain just how important it is, whether it's in the Red Sea in the Middle East or whether it's in Indo-PACOM, in the territorial waters around the Philippines or Taiwan? Why is freedom of navigation for international shipping so important to France and America?
I would like to make a small point. I think that what just happened is really important because the idea that Iran decided to attack from its soil directly towards Israel is a change of paradigm. And I think we shouldn't think that it's something that is benign. That we don't know yet all the consequences,
right.
But it's certainly a reminder of the possibility of Iran as a real destabilization factor in all the region, and it's really something that we will have to focus on in the future. Freedom of navigation is really part of the whole economic system. It's both linked to respect of sovereignty, but also of the world we have been building with free trade. And if we allow actors to disrupt all the chain of communication, supply chain are going to be disrupted. It's a real challenge to the economy. And it's important that we don't let any country take advantage and organize a blockade in order to take political or economic advantage. And it's important that we make the point by passing and making that international law being respected.
Well, you are of course, the French ambassador to the United States. What would be your closing message to the American people?
Well, we have been allies for nearly 250 years, and we attach the greatest importance to that. And it's so important, and I'm so glad that I'm here at the moment we are going to celebrate one of the great moments of our relation. And I just would like to thank again the greatest generation. I met a few of the veterans already, and that each time it's so moving.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Bili, the French ambassador to the United States. This is Morgan Ortagus with the Morgan Ortagus Show on Sirius XM Patriot Channel 125.